It's never been easier to create responsive layouts that look beautiful on every screen. In this 3-part mini-series, I'll be showing you how to build this front-end mentor project from scratch. In this video, I'll be building out the header and navigation menu. So if you're ready, fire up your favorite editor and let's code. First, I'll download the front-end mentor project and open the zip file. The free download comes with a starter HTML file, all the images, plus screenshots of the designs. If you have the Pro version of Front-End Mentor, there will also be a Figma file included in the starter pack. Here I've added the JPEGs to my own Figma file so I can easily refer to them as I work. The design specifies a desktop and mobile version. On mobile, everything stacks in a single column. For desktop views, there are 3 main sections to build: the header, the hero, and the article list. For this video, I'll be building out the header. In my HTML file, I have the basic boilerplate with links to my style sheet, JavaScript file, and the Google fonts required by the design. In the body, I've added some placeholders for the 3 sections I'll be creating: the header, the hero, and the article list. In the CSS file, I've set up some custom properties. I've also added a reset, which I always source from Andy Bell. Find links to his 2023 version in the description below. For a small project like this, I also like to add global styles to the reset. For example, font and link styles. I also like to set up utility classes for use later on. For right now, I've set up the screen reader only utility. More about this later. Now that we've got the basics, let's start on the markup. First, I'll add markup for the header, making sure to use semantic elements whenever possible. Now, this is not an in-depth tutorial on accessibility, but using semantic markup is the first step to provide a great experience for assistive technology users. I'll add an H1 for the page title and use a screen reader only utility class I created earlier. This class removes the heading visually while keeping it in the accessibility tree. I'll rely on the accessibility tree in DevTools throughout this video, just to make sure I'm exposing the same functionality to all users. Next, I'll add an image tag for the logo. I'll leave the alt attribute blank to hide it from screen readers. I'll also give the image width and height attributes. This way the browser can calculate the correct amount of space to reserve for the image while it downloads. Next up, I'll add a nav tag along with an unordered list containing 5 list items. On mobile, the nav menu will be hidden until the user clicks the hamburger button to open it. To expose this functionality to screen readers, I'll use the button tag and nest the image of the hamburger menu inside. Again, I'll leave the alt attribute blank and add width and height attributes for the browser. I've added the button outside of the nav tag because I want it to be visible while the menu is hidden. We also need a button to close the navigation menu, so I'll add that inside the nav tag. This way, it will appear next to the menu when it's in view. I'll wrap the button and list in a div and give it a class of nav menu. This will make things easier later on when I add styles and functionality. Now that the header markup is in place, I can start on the styles and layout. First, I'll add some padding to the top and bottom of the header. Now from this point on, I'll be writing my styles using the new CSS nesting feature. I find it provides a bit of organization and helps to avoid any specificity issues. So I'll select all of the buttons inside the primary header and remove some of those default styles like background, border, and padding. The header layout will consist of a 4-column grid. The 2 outer columns will act as margins, while the 2 inner columns will hold the content. To set up the grid, I'll add display grid to the primary header. I use grid template columns to specify the sizing for each column. I'll give the 2 outer columns a minimum size of 1 rem and a maximum size of 1 fr, or 1 fraction of the available space. According to the design specs, the desktop view is considered to be 1440 pixels, or 90 rem. So this will be the maximum allowed width for the content. Because the navigation links take up more space than the icon, I'll assign a max size of 60 rem to the 3rd column and 30 rem to the 2nd. Both columns get a minimum size of 0. If I take a look in DevTools, I can see that the grid is working and the columns are adjusting as intended. As the viewport shrinks, the two outer columns shrink to no smaller than 1 rem, preventing the content from touching the sides. As the viewport widens, they take up 1 fraction of the total available space. For a more in-depth explanation of this pattern, check out my video on building flexible layouts using grid. Links in the description. Now that the grid is in place, let's place the content and style the mobile view. I'll start by placing the logo in the grid column between lines 2 and 3. In the mobile design, the primary navigation has a transparent background and covers the whole viewport. The nav menu overlaps 3/4 of it. We can use a bit of positioning to easily achieve this look. To start, I'll give the primary navigation a background color and a position of fixed. This way I can use the inset shorthand to set its top, right, bottom, and left properties to 0. Now the whole navigation element is covering the entire viewport. To match the design, I'll give the nav menu a background color of white and add some padding. Since the nav menu is a direct child of the primary navigation, setting its position to absolute will move it in the viewport relative to where the primary navigation is. Again, I'll use the inset shorthand to set the nav menu's top, bottom, and right values to 0. I'll set the left value to 35. This will move it away from the left edge by 35%. I'll use flex with the direction of column on the nav menu to lay out the button and nav list. Adding a gap helps to space out the flex items a bit. I'll do the same thing for the nav list. This time adding a gap of 2 rem to give the links some breathing room. To match the design, I'll give the anchor tags a heavier font weight. I'll give them a larger touch target by adding a bit of padding. I'll also add hover and focus states. Finally, I'll give the nav close button a margin left of auto to push it to the right side. Now that the primary navigation is completely styled for mobile views, let's style it for larger screens. Inside a media query for screens larger than 48M, I'll give all the buttons in the primary header a display of none. Not only does this remove them from view, but it also removes them from the accessibility tree. This is helpful because it prevents us from exposing non-functioning buttons to screen readers. Then I'll set the position of both the primary navigation and the nav menu back to their initial value of static. This places them back into the document flow. Next, I'll switch the direction of the nav list to row and justify its content to the end. This way, it'll sit flush with the edge of the column. Since the primary navigation is a grid item, I'll place it in the grid column between lines 3 and 4. I can also use the align self property to center it within the grid cell. Now the links in the logo are horizontally centered. Finally, I'll move the primary navigation off screen for mobile. I use the translate property to move it along the x-axis, or to the right by 100%. I'll give it a transition to make the movement smoother. To slide it back into view on larger screens, I'll set translate back to 0 inside the media query. Since the nav open button is also a grid item, I can use the justify self property to push it to the end of the column. And that's the nav styling done and dusted. The header and navigation are looking great on all viewports. However, we want to be able to control the menu using the open and close buttons. For this, we'll leverage some ARIA attributes and JavaScript. I want to start by saying that I'm not an accessibility expert, and that I've used a lot of references in building this part of the project. Most notably, this video from Coder, which I'll link in the description below. For me, using the accessibility tree in DevTools was key to understanding what was actually going on. You can enable it here in DevTools. Currently, the buttons aren't very accessible since they don't contain any inner text. If I open up the accessibility tree in DevTools, I can see that no accessible name is assigned. To fix this, I'll add a span tag containing the text Open Navigation Menu. Since the design specs don't include button text, I'll use the hidden attribute to hide the span from view. Next, I'll need to label the button using the span text. To do this, I'll add the ARIA labeled by attribute to the button. Then I'll add an ID to the span tag. By setting the value of the ARIA attribute to the value of the ID, I've essentially labeled the button. If I open up the accessibility tree, I can see that the button now has a span text as its name. I'll do the same thing for the close button. Now we can add some basic functionality to the button. To the nav open button, I'll add the ARIA expanded attribute with the value set to false. This will indicate to screen readers that the navigation menu is collapsed. I'll also give an ID to both buttons. This I'll use later on in the JavaScript. Next, I'll add some styles to open the navigation menu. Back in my CSS file, I'll use the attribute selector to target the nav open button when the ARIA expanded attribute is set to true. Since the primary navigation is the element we want to open, I'll select it using the adjacent sibling selector. To slide it back into view, I'll set the translate property to 0 and give it a bit of transition to smooth out the movement. In my JavaScript file, I'll set constants for both the open and close buttons. Then I'll set up two functions, one to open the nav menu and one to close it. To open the navigation, I'll set the ARIA expanded attribute on the open button to true. Then I'll set an event listener on the open button, so that when the user clicks, the open nav function will fire. To close the navigation, I'll set the ARIA expanded attribute on the open button to false. I'll set an event listener on the close button so that when the user clicks, the close nav function fires. If I take a look in DevTools, I can see that our functions are working. The ARIA expanded values toggle between true and false, and the menu opens and closes as intended. And there it is, the header portion of this page is complete. With minimal effort, we can create responsive headers that look great on all viewports. Stay tuned for part 2 of this series where we explore subgrid. Hey everyone, thanks for watching and be sure to subscribe for more CSS builds. Until next time, happy coding!